Boss fights in survival games have always been some of the most crucial pieces of progression that players have to work towards during their many playthroughs. Whether that's be to acquire new materials to upgrade their tools, base and so on, unlocking brand new areas of the world to explore and make their own, or just to tick another box off on a metaphorical checklist to see how far they've come over the course of their adventures. All of these feelings are some of the base elements that make sandbox survival games work in the first place. Not only that sense of intrigue that comes with discovering what the boss was hiding from you before it went down, but also allowing the player to prove to themselves that their efforts up to this point have actually amounted to something, and that they should keep playing the game in order to chase that feeling even more. It's pretty simple stuff for any game like Terraria. Terraria, being far more of a boss rush compared to most other games within this genre, like Minecraft, which only has 2 real bosses, maybe a third if you squint hard enough at the Warden, has obviously honed in on this kind of gameplay loop and made it a key focus. So a large number of bosses in this game do try to incorporate one or more of these feelings. From Skeletron guarding the mysterious dungeon and the enticing loot it holds, Plantera prohibiting access to the massive jungle temple until her defeat, to less important examples such as Duke Fishron and the Queen Bee, holding some of the most powerful weapons and gear you can get at the time you're expected to fight them. Pretty much every boss in this game, except from that bum King Slime, holds significance to the player's journey. However, if you were to ask me which boss, in design, gameplay and so on, holds the most significance, well, I believe that I and many other players would share the same answer: the Wall of Flesh. The Guardian of Hard Mode, one of the most visually striking enemies in this entire game, and I'd argue the most unique fight in this game. This sack of meat is one of the most iconic entities that this game has to offer. So how has this creature managed to become one of the most important and well-loved encounters in this game full of great bosses? Let's find out, but maybe from a safer distance. Just like in my Eye of Cthulhu video, shameless plug I know, I want to go over the events before actually fighting the boss from a new player perspective, as I believe it is crucial for understanding the impact that the Wall of Flesh has in so many areas of a playthrough, even more so in this case because there's so many more factors at play than the eyeball. So firstly, the stomping ground of this thing is just straight up hell, no nonsense, just fire and brimstone at the bottom of your world, and a new player is likely to stumble across it on accident a lot earlier than they're expected to actually be exploring the place. The underworld is the final place that we are expected to plunder in pre-hard mode, having both the strongest and most dangerous enemies you can encounter before the Wall of Flesh, as well as by far the most dangerous terrain you can traverse in the entire game honestly, outside of maybe the dungeon, with massive lava pits, hellstone that can drain your health rather quickly, and so on that can very swiftly turn you into a nice pile of ash. Combine that with the pressure of the imps and demons firing a ton of projectiles at you from a mile away, and the lava slimes and hellbats getting you from close range, and this place is easily the most hostile place you can find, and will likely destroy most inexperienced players the first time they come here. In the likely short time they're able to explore this place before getting served well done at the demon's feast, they have a decent chance at finding a certain variant of the demon that is holding a strange doll. But it isn't just some faceless doll, no. It's very clearly meant to be the guide that's been with them since they spawned into the world, which is gonna start ringing some alarm bells in the player's head, especially if they just so happen to read the guide's advice about fighting the keeper of the underworld, and how it needs a human sacrifice. When the player kills the voodoo demon, one of two things are going to happen. Either the player harmlessly picks up the voodoo doll and saves it for when they're ready and finish with their prep, which we'll get into, or the demon decides to die just above one of the many lava pools of the underworld. The player can't exactly catch it or else they'll die in the lava, and they're suddenly being chased down by a monster that takes up the entire bloody height of the underworld, making them likely to panic and try to run, fail because this thing traps you in literal hell, ultimately leading to a very sudden and embarrassing death. After going through that traumatic event, the player is really going to want a round 2, both to get their revenge for such a humiliating defeat, and to make sure that they don't need to go through that crap ever again. So they're going to go through what is most likely the most rigorous preparation they've ever gone through in the game up to this point, taking resources from every aspect of pre-hard mode, to tackle this beast. The materials from the Corruption and Crimson and their respective bosses allow them to make either Demonite or Crimtane tools that then allow them to make Hellstone, which unlocks the most fearsome weaponry that they can get their hands on at this point, whether that be the sturdy Molten Armor or the Volcano Sword, the final component in creating the ever-iconic Knight's Edge, which, especially after the rework in 1.4.4, is an absolute force against anything you fight. And even the dungeon or jungle hold very valuable items that can help a lot with this fight, such as the Cobalt Shield, which drops knockback, and the Beanades that can shred the health bars of bosses in seconds. But After the player arms themselves to the teeth with all of these little goodies, a question is probably going to start creeping into their heads. You see, with pretty much every boss up to this point, they've all been in biomes that aren't really that difficult to navigate or build around. The worst that they've probably experienced is whatever world evil they fought the Eater of Worlds or the Brain of Cthulhu in, which only really need some explosives and platforms to make a good enough arena to tackle them. But how on earth are they meant to do this for the Wall of Flesh? Not only is the underworld an utter nightmare to traverse quickly because of all the obsidian and hellstone towers that litter the place, but the lava and very vertically inconsistent structure of the entire biome are going to make it very hard to run away from this thing at any speed. And considering it takes up the entire height of the underworld and can't be knocked back, running away is kind of a necessity. So, the only realistic way to build around this thing is to make a gigantic platform across nearly the entire width of your world, or just half of it if you're lazy like me, along with mining all of these annoying towers and terrain spikes that you could get stuck on. Having to basically terraform an entire major biome in a game where worlds can be as large as Terraria's is an utterly insane commitment you need to go through in order to fight a single boss. This is the kind of building project that most diehard players in other similar survival games just don't have the patience to do, because the time investment above all else is massive considering how many blocks are going to be mined to clean up this place. Not to mention how much money the player might spend on explosives that the demolitionist sells to try and speed up the process. So making it at least partially a requirement to have a stable fight is an insane expectation to give players, as well as a pretty big risk. The possibility of players just not wanting to go through that and throwing themselves at the boss silly style, which is likely going to make them very, very frustrated as they fail to navigate the biome and get crushed by the wall over and over, is a very real thing that can make this boss a massive pain. But in my experience, it only makes the anticipation for finally getting to overcome this thing that much stronger. All of this varied and in-depth preparation for this boss does so much to enrich the gameplay experience every hard mode by not only making its grand finale feel very climactic and important before the player even knows what comes afterwards if they're new to the game, but it also makes so many actions that they've taken previously feel so much more important. Suddenly they're scrambling in their old chest to find older swords they used, to build the Knight's Edge for example. Their entire playthrough feels like it has led up to this one fight in the most hostile place they found up to this point. Every single thing surrounding this fight makes it truly feel like one of the landmark moments of the entire playthrough, and that feeling of everything changing once it's been taken down is likely going to be locked into the head at this point. So the only thing left to do right now is to dive into hell one more time, make the sacrifice of the guide that helped them so much, unless they, use the wiki, but work with me here, and fight the Wall of Flesh once and for all. This fight has a lot of hidden depth that many players aren't likely to immediately pick up on during any one given fight, so let's go through each attack and unique feature of the fight one by one to get the full picture of why this fight is so good, starting with likely the most important part, the boss's movement. Taking up the entire vertical axis of the underworld, the player is forced to be on the run for the entire fight, doubly so due to the horrified debuff the boss gives any player close enough to it, preventing anyone from either leaving the underworld or going behind it, lest they get tongued, which already makes the fight rather intense as it's on a hard time limit, as if the wall gets to the end of your runway, or god forbid the end of the world, it is game over. So players really have to consider the balance between keeping their distance to avoid contact damage, and getting in close enough for their own hits to be effective. Additionally, as its health gets lower and lower, it will speed up to speeds rivaling the Hermes boots in expert mode and above, making the later stages of the fight a complete mad dash to finish the thing off, creating this effective ramping of the tension as the fight goes on. Another piece of the puzzle that adds to the feeling of chaos in the fight are the two kinds of mobs it spawns, the Hungry and Leeches, both of which aim to disrupt the flow of movement from the player. The Hungry spawn in with the boss immediately and cover both eyes and the mouth, the only places that can actually take damage, meaning that they demand attention immediately to keep your DPS up. But once they take enough damage, they fly off their tendrils and fly towards the player, forcing them to vary their movements so that the Hungry heads don't knock them back into the wall, or it forces them to change their accessories to accommodate for the Cobalt shield. The leeches perform a similar function, but instead of flying around the player, they can burrow into the ground and catch them by surprise, demanding even more spatial awareness from the player, who also just can't afford to ignore them, as they have a chance to drop hearts that can heal them mid-fight, creating even more choices that the player is forced to take, all while the wall approaches them faster and faster. It all comes together to make such an effective rush. There's a couple of smaller changes left about the fight that all add some subtle changes to how it plays out, mainly on the higher difficulties, so let's rapid fire through some of them now. The eye lasers that the eyeball shoots at you often mean that you can't simply run in a straight line for the entire fight. You need to jump at times as well, which makes you more vulnerable to the flying hungry heads, overall making your every move during the fight that much more important to think about in real time. The eyes and mouth have the ability to move up and down the wall depending on the terrain that they slide across, usually trying to avoid being behind solid blocks, meaning that the player actually needs to pay fairly close attention to their aim if they're using a ranged weapon, which considering the distance you need to keep from this thing is very likely, making that balance of not being too far or too close from the boss that much more important to maintain. The emphasis on positioning is a theme that's not many other bosses in this game quite nail, like this one does. All of these design choices create a fight that varies so much depending on each individual player's own playstyle, to a point where pretty much every single class is going to have a different experience when fighting the boss. The rangers and mages of the world are likely to have the smoothest experience with this thing, as not only do they have some of the best individual counters to the boss, such as the insane DPS of B&As and the piercing and crowd control of stuff like the water bolt, but they can also keep their distance far more comfortably than other classes, while not sacrificing too much of their damage, making both of these classes ideal choices. Summoners have a very complex time with this boss, as if they stay too far away and let their summons do all of the work, then the hungry are likely to body block a lot of their DPS, and lead to the wall quickly leaving the player with nowhere to run as they take too long. But using the whips forces them to stay much closer than they would like considering their low defense, meaning that they really have to consider when to get their damage in, and when to goddamn skedaddle. Then we have the melee classes who are going to be suffering unless they have some pretty specific weapons, like yo-yos or the Knight's Edge obviously. They can't viably stay at a safe distance while also getting in enough damage, so melee users are forced into staying risky and aggressive, making for maybe the fastest but most intense fight out of any of these classes. This incredible variety in how each class has to approach this fight is such great design in my opinion, and an experience that is only really possible, at least to this extent, in this stage at the end of pre-hard mode. The further you get into this game, pretty much every single class has the tools to do insane DPS from very safe distances. From the many sword beam options for melee, to whips that can cover an entire USA in a single swing for summoner, and so on. So a boss that relies so much on maintaining this middle distance just isn't going to work later in the game. But at the end of pre-hard mode, it's late enough for each class to have made itself distinct with its own weapons and armor, but also early enough to where each class still has its own clear weaknesses that need to be taken into account. So the Wall of Flesh can really benefit from the player's strengths and weaknesses to provide a distinct and interesting challenge that goes far past how much DPS do you have and what potions did you chug. Sure, both of these are key factors to victory, but they're not dominant at all, which makes this fight one of the most engaging in the game. That's everything that I need to say about the fight itself, but just behind this fleshy wall, there is so much to discuss about the impact of this thing's defeat, so let's talk a bit about that. The death of the Wall of Flesh is basically a second beginning for this game, with hard mode unlocking about, the decent majority of the items in the entire game, and the vast majority of items that anyone actually cares about. So the immediate impact of killing the wall is likely the biggest rush of new content that the player is going to have outside of playing for the first time at the start of the world. Before we actually touch on that new content though, the wall itself just gave you a nice box of goodies that have a lot of significance to the start of hard mode. The weapons it drops are kind of hit or miss. The Buster Blade is notoriously outclassed by most other swords at this point. The laser rifle is fine enough, but mages have more than enough stronger options for weapons at this point. But the Firecracker and Clockwork Assault Rifle are genuinely solid options for the major ramp in difficulty that this part of the game introduces, being able to at least keep up with the inflated health bars of every enemy now. Most importantly, however, we have the Pwn Hammer, which allows you to finally destroy the demon altars to access the hard mode ores, unlocking the key methods of crafting in hard mode, which are obviously massive. And in expert mode, the demon heart it drops allows you to unlock an entirely new accessory slot as well, which can massively bolster any build, which is awesome for this part of the game where so many new options are now available to you, such as the emblems that the wall also drops, which can give a solid damage boost. With all of these new upgrades from the boss itself, the player may feel like they're slightly more prepared for the entirely new world that's in front of them now, but that's just from a gear perspective. I actually believe that the wall also prepares the player for the general pace of play that hard mode introduces as well, and what the player should expect from the combats going forward. Terraria's hard mode bosses are obviously far more complex than their pre-hard mode counterparts, the most obvious examples being the mechanical bosses that are basically just souped up versions of 3 bosses you've already faced, but these bosses all have a much stronger focus on movement and playing on a strict time limit, something that the Wall of Flesh really drilled into the player. Yes, other pre-hard mode bosses did teach these lessons in a less strict way, but the Wall of Flesh feels like the first one to really test you on all of them at the same time, something that becomes the standard for all bosses going forward. So the Wall of Flesh serves a crucial purpose at raising the stakes of the game and the boss fights. Now, it can be hard to link the Wall of Flesh to the upcoming hard mode, as after you beat this thing, there's actually very little reason to go back and fight the boss again, as is the case with most bosses in this game outside of grinding for the rest of the weapons or emblems. And to go even further, the entirety of the underworld becomes largely obsolete after you beat the wall, except for some niche farming purposes for weapons like the Hellfire, or for Red Devil specifically, if anyone still cares about that guy. This sticks out heavily from the rest of the biomes, which all get new content upon entering hard mode, from the dungeon getting a revamp once Plantera is defeated, the desert and snow biomes getting a few new enemies for their weather events, hell, even the ocean gets a new boss in Duke Fishron. So the underworld being largely empty-handed is strange, which makes the Wall of Flesh team even more important. In a roundabout way, I'll admit, but the underworld being pretty much complete after the wall falls gives the player a strong sense of completion and pride, like they just fully conquered this entire section of the world, motivating them to push forward and experience the rest of this incredible game, and conquer the rest of the world, showing how this boss is one of the best and most important parts of their whole adventure. And with that, I think I've said everything I want to about the boss. The impact of individual boss fights like the Wall of Flesh on the entire game often goes ignored due to not being the flashiest, most complex fights compared to enemies such as the Moonlord. So the deeper and harder to explain design choices that went into the fights, to me at least, have always deserved to get more praise. On top of that, this game's emphasis on boss fights compared to most others in the genre has always been one of the key things that have defined fans' love for the game, as it's one of the things that makes the game stand out. So the boss that gatekeeps over half of the game's best content has to be one of the best designs the devs have to offer, and I hope that I've done enough to convince you that they succeeded with flying colours. With all of that being said though, make sure to burn that subscribe button, and as always, I'll see you when I see you. Bye!